A Nobel Prize, Economics Prize, goes to pioneers in understanding poverty. Randomized trials help policymakers grasp which policies work and which don't. The most important question in economics the hardest. Is also the hardest. Why do some countries stay poor while others grow rich? In 2015, 10% of the world's population lived on less than 1.9 dollars per day, down from 36% in 1990. But more than 7 million people live in extreme poverty, and the number grows every year in certain parts of the world, in particular the sub-Saharan Africa. For their contributions to understand gaps in development, the better to close them. Abhijit Banjari, Esther Duflo, and Michael Kramer have been awarded this year's Nobel Prize for Economics. All three are Americans, though Mr. Banzerni and Mr. Duflo are immigrants and married to each other. Mrs. Duflo is only the second woman to have received the prize, and at 46, the youngest winner ever. 30 years ago, economists mostly looked at the big picture. They studied larger-scale structural transformations from rural and agricultural to urban and industrial. Macroeconomists built growth theories around variables such as human capital, then ran cross-country growth regressions to try to measure relationships, for example, between years of schooling and GDP per person. But data were scarce or poor, and the vast number of potentially relevant forces made it hard to be sure what caused what. In the mid-1990s, Mr. Kramer at Harvard University tried something different. With collaborators and co-authors, he began studying poverty with methods more commonly associated with chemists and biologists. Randomized trials. If human capital, health, education, skills, and so forth is essential for development, then economists had to better make sure they understand where it comes from. In Kenya, he conducted field experiments in which schools were randomly divided into groups, some subject to policy intervention and others not. He tested, among other things, additional textbooks, deworming treatments, and financial incentives for teachers linked to their pupils' progress. Each such experiment shed a little light on one small part of the hardest question. Educational resources, textbooks say, turned out to do little for learning outcomes. Making pupils healthier improved their attendance, but did not necessarily mean they learned more. The experiments had a larger result, however. They taught the economics profession that randomized trials could work in the field. Mr. Banjari and Mrs. Duflo built on the foundation Mr. Kramer laid, deploying randomized trials to study healthcare and entrepreneurship, as well as education. In India, they found that focusing extra teaching resources on pupils who had fallen behind paid big dividends. They showed that microloans, small-scale lending to the cash-strapped poor, were less transformative than had been claimed, but could help ambitious entrepreneurs. The three scholars have studied absenteeism among teachers and nurses, immunization programs, and the management of public infrastructure, and the use of productivity-boosting technologies such as fertilizer. They have spent countless hours observing and learning from the daily struggles of the world's poor. By breaking big questions into smaller ones and tackling each in carefully designed experiments, they overcame some hard epistemological problems. Economists who used cross-country regressions could not easily say whether extra schooling boosted growth or merely occurred alongside it. Field experiments, by contrast, could show not only the link between better teaching and greater learning, but how the connection worked. There remained the problem of external validity, the extent to which a measured relationship holds outside the research context. People are complex and the world ever changing. Thus, it is hard to be confident that a relationship between two variables will endure. Researchers must also be aware that the groups being tested may differ subtly from a broader population, or that something in the experiment may be influencing participants' behavior. In mastering field research, Mr. Banjari and Mrs. Tuflo showed how to overcome these difficulties. Natural experiments, such as an oil shock, cannot be rerun to satisfy nagging doubts. Field experiments can be replicated. Structuring experiments so that they can be scaled up over time permits greater confidence still. A developing story. Each nugget of truth prized out of the data generated by field experiments represents a contribution to understanding the world. The hope is that many small truths can be piled together to make a big one. This laborious work uses economic theory as a guide, but nonetheless represents a departure from the discipline's business as usual, in which economists peer down from on higher society and seek to discover the equivalent of Newton's laws of motion. Randomized trials are a part of an important development in recent decades, away from high theory and towards an empirical grounding. With these awards, the Nobel Committee endorsed the shift. It is furthermore a practical award celebrating work that offers ways to improve lives. But the hardest question still looms. Mr. Banjari and Mrs. Duflo reckon that their work builds towards an answer. Taken together, the experiments reveal that the gap in productivity between the most and least efficient producers is much wider in developing economies than in advanced ones. Fix that one small intervention at a time, and perhaps eventually the hard question will go away. More macro-minded economists counter that the huge fall in global poverty of the past 3 decades owes little to such fiddling. It happened rather as a confluence of global forces buoyed poor countries' fortunes. The mystery of global poverty remains. If enough economists emulate the innovative spirit and scholarly care of this year's laureates, it will not remain forever.